At exactly 7:15 on the morning of September 20th, 1944, Major Charles Carpenter climbed into the narrow cockpit of his L-4 Grasshopper at a muddy forward airstrip near Arracourt, France. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of war. A thick layer of fog rolled across the ground, swallowing everything beyond a few hundred yards. It wasn't just whether it was a curtain, and behind that curtain something deadly was moving. Carpenter sat still for a moment, hands resting on the controls, eyes fixed ahead. He wasn't looking at the runway, he was looking through the fog, imagining what lay beyond. German armor advancing, closing in. 3 miles away, elements of the German 5th Panzer Army were pushing forward in a coordinated counterattack. Intelligence reports had confirmed it 47 Panther tanks supported by armored cars and mechanized infantry. Their objective was simple: break through American lines and crush the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A. And right now, they were winning. Carpenter was 31 years old. Before the war, he had been a high school history teacher in Illinois. A quiet man, disciplined, observant, the kind of person who preferred thinking over talking. When war came, he didn't hesitate. He enlisted, trained, and eventually became an artillery spotter pilot. It sounded important, but in reality it meant watching, always watching. His aircraft, the L-4 Grasshopper, was never meant to fight. It was a military adaptation of the Piper J-3 Cub, a simple civilian plane with fabric-covered wings and a tiny 40-horsepower engine. It had no armor, no weapons, no protection, just 2 seats and a radio. Its top speed barely reached 85 miles per hour. In a war dominated by fighters and bombers, it was almost laughable, fragile. Exposed. German soldiers had a nickname for it. They called it the Maytag Messerschmitt because it sounded like a washing machine. And yet, for months, those planes had flown almost untouched over the battlefield. Not because they were invisible, but because of an unspoken agreement, a strange, silent understanding between enemies. German troops usually didn't fire at them, because the moment they did, they revealed their position. And when that happened, American artillery would respond fast, accurately. So the Grasshoppers were allowed to fly, to observe, to report, but never to fight, and that was the problem. Carpenter had spent months in the air, flying mission after mission, watching the war unfold beneath him. He tracked troop movements, identified supply routes, marked enemy positions. His voice over the radio guided artillery strikes that could wipe out entire units. But it was never enough. It was always too late. 3 weeks earlier, near Lunéville, everything changed. The 4th Armored Division had run into a wall of German Panthers. In just 6 days, 41 American Sherman tanks were destroyed. 32 crews were killed. Some burned alive inside their vehicles. Others never even had time to react. Carpenter saw it all from above. He flew over the battlefield again and again, watching black smoke rise into the sky, counting destroyed tanks, marking coordinates, reporting positions, but the outcome never changed. The Panthers always fired first, they always hit first. Their guns were superior, their armor was stronger, their optics were better. They could see American tanks from nearly 2,000 yards away. By the time a Sherman crew realized they were being targeted, the shell was already on its way. Impact plans. Carpenter heard the radio calls, desperate voices, men shouting coordinates, begging for artillery support. Fire mission, we're taking it since static, then nothing. And every time Carpenter was there above them, watching, tracking, doing nothing, that helplessness began to eat at him, because he could see everything. He could see German tanks repositioning before attacks. He could see supply convoys moving through forest roads. He could see weak points, openings, opportunity. He wasn't allowed to. He was just an observer. That word started to feel like a curse. 3 months of this kind of war changes a man, slowly at first, then all at once. 2 days before September 20th, Carpenter walked across the airstrip with a purpose he had never felt before. Mechanics were working on engines, ground crews moved supplies, pilots prepared for routine missions, everything looked normal. But inside Carpenter's mind, something had already shifted. He found an ordnance technician, Sergeant William Morrison, working near a maintenance tent. Morrison was known for one thing: if something could be built, he could build it. Carpenter didn't waste time. "Can you mount bazookas on my plane?" Morrison blinked, then laughed. He thought it was a joke until he saw Carpenter's face. "Serious, focused on moving. You're serious?" Morrison asked. Carpenter nodded. 6 of them, he said, under the wings, wired to the cockpit. Now the laughter was on, because this wasn't just unusual, it was insane. The L-4 wasn't designed to carry weapons. It barely carried its own weight. Adding bazookas would push it beyond its limits. It would become unstable, dangerous, possibly uncontrollable. "If you fire those things," Morrison said slowly, "you could rip the wings off." Carpenter stepped closer. "I'm done watching men die." Silence filled the space between them. That was the moment everything changed. They started working that same day, mostly at night, quietly, carefully, breaking rules that technically didn't even allow this to exist. The first challenge was weight. The Grasshopper could only carry about 232 pounds of additional load. Each M1 bazooka weighed around 13 pounds. 6 of them added up quickly. Then came the mounting brackets, wiring, switches, and rockets themselves. They were pushing the aircraft to its absolute limit. Still, they kept going. Each bazooka was mounted beneath the wing struts. Morrison adjusted the angle carefully, about 15 degrees upward. That angle wasn't random. It allowed the rockets to arc toward a target during a dive, giving Carpenter a small window to fire and escape. Inside the cockpit, Morrison built a control system from scratch. 6 toggle switches, one for each rocket. Flip the switch, send current through copper wiring, ignite the propellant, and launch. Simple if it worked. The rockets themselves were M6 high-explosive anti-tank rounds, small but powerful. Each used a shaped charge designed to focus explosive force into a narrow jet capable of penetrating armor. Not enough for the front of a Panther tank, but maybe enough for the top, and that was the plan. Attack from above, hit where they were weakest. Escape before they could respond, but the risks were extreme. Carpenter would have seconds, literally seconds, to line up a shot during a dive. Too early, and he'd miss. Too late, and he'd crash. And all the while, enemy machine guns would be firing at him. The Grasshopper had no armor, no protection. One bullet could end everything. Late that night, Morrison finished the final wiring. He stepped back and looked at what they had created. Didn't look like a proper weapon. It looked like a gamble. "You sure about this?" he asked. Carpenter paused, then thought about the burning Shermans. The radio calls, the silence after he climbed into the cockpit. Morning came, fog still covered the ground, but it was thin. Carpenter started the engine. The familiar rattling sound filled the air, except now, there was nothing familiar about what he was about to do. He pushed the throttle forward. The Grasshopper rolled down the uneven strip, faster, then lifted into the air. For a moment, everything felt the same. Same aircraft, same sky, same mission, but this time he wasn't just an observer. As the fog began to lift, shapes appeared below. Dark, massive, moving. 5 Panther tanks advancing, and under Carpenter's wings, 6 rockets waited. The fog had almost completely lifted now. From 1,100 yards out, Major Charles Carpenter could see them clearly. 5 German Panther tanks. Dark steel beasts crawling across the French countryside in a staggered formation. Their turrets rotated slowly, scanning for threats. Engines rumbled. Tracks crushed everything beneath them, grass, dirt, anything that stood in their path. Behind them, armored cars followed like shadows. The entire column stretched nearly 800 yards. Carpenter's heartbeat quickened. This was it. No more observing, no more waiting. He pushed the control stick forward. The L-4 Grasshopper dipped into a shallow dive. Altitude dropped 900 feet, 800, 700. The aircraft vibrated slightly as speed increased. Wind rushed past the cockpit. The tiny plane felt even smaller now, exposed against the sky like a target waiting to be shot down. At 600 feet, something changed below. The Germans saw him. A Panther's home-out machine gun suddenly came alive. Tracer rounds tore through the air, streaking upward in bright orange lines. They weren't ignoring him anymore. The gentleman's agreement was over. Bullets snapped past the cockpit. Carpenter heard a ripping sound of fabric tearing somewhere along the wing. The aircraft shuddered violently for a split second. He didn't look, couldn't afford to. 500 feet. The lead Panther filled his vision, now massive, deadly. He could see details of hatches, bolts, even the commander standing half exposed from the turret. The man pointed upward, shouting something to his crew. Carpenter flipped the first toggle switch. Nothing happened. No launch, no sound, no recoil. His stomach dropped. He flipped it again. Still nothing. A wiring failure. Dead battery. Loose connection. There was no time to think. 400 feet. The Panther's turret began to turn. That massive 75mm gun slowly aligned toward him. If it fired, there would be nothing left. Carpenter reached for the switch. Flipped. This time the bazooka fired. A sudden burst of smoke. The rocket shot forward with a sharp, violent kick. The Grasshopper lurched sideways from the recoil, nearly throwing Carpenter off balance. He gripped the controls tightly, fighting to keep the aircraft steady. The rocket left a thin white trail behind it as it arced downward. Time seemed to slow. Carpenter watched it descend closer, then impact. The rocket struck the Panther's engine deck directly. A sharp explosion ripped across the tank's rear. Metal fragments burst outward. Smoke immediately began pouring from the engine compartment. The tank jerked to a halt. The commander disappeared inside. The hatch slammed shut. Black smoke thickened. The engine was dead. One tank neutralized. Carpenter pulled back hard on the stick. The Grasshopper climbed sharply, engine straining. More machine gun fire followed him. Bullets zipped past his canopy. One round smashed into the instrument panel, shattering glass. Tiny shards sprayed across his lap, but the engine kept running. The controls still responded. He was alive. At 800 feet, he banked hard left. Below, the remaining Panthers were no longer advancing in formation. They were scattering, repositioning, reacting. They understood now this wasn't just a harmless observation plane. This was a threat. Carpenter circled once, scanning. An armored car broke away from the formation, racing toward a stone farmhouse, likely trying to find cover. Carpenter turned toward it. Second dive. 600 feet, 500, 400. Machine gun fire erupted again. The sky around him filled with tracers. He flipped the third switch. Another rocket launched. The Grasshopper jerked again. The rocket slammed into the armored car's side. Explosion. The vehicle erupted into flames instantly. Fire poured out of its open top. Seconds later, secondary explosions began as ammunition inside detonated violently. The armored car was destroyed. 2 targets down. But now, Carpenter had a problem. Actually, 2 problems. First, the aircraft was no longer balanced. With rockets fired from one side, the weight distribution had shifted. The Grasshopper wanted to roll to the right. Carpenter had to constantly fight the controls just to keep it level. Second, every German unit on the ground now knew he was hostile. A Panther fired its main gun. The shell screamed past him and missed, but barely. The pressure wave hit the Grasshopper like a punch. The aircraft bucked violently. Carpenter's ears rang from the shock. For a split second, he thought he'd been hit, but the engine still roared. He was still flying 300 feet. He lined up another tank, flipped the force switch. The rocket fired but missed. It slammed into the ground just short of the target, kicking up dirt and debris. Shrapnel rattled against the Panther's armor but didn't penetrate. Carpenter cursed under his breath. 2 rockets left, but he was losing altitude fast. He pulled up hard. Climbing back to 1,000 feet, his fuel gauge caught his eye. Half empty, he'd only been in the air for about 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Below him, the situation was getting worse. Beyond the tank column, he spotted something new. American vehicles, support units, water trucks, supply jeeps. Around 40 men pinned down behind a low ridge, and the Panthers were moving toward them. Fast. Carpenter didn't need a radio call. He didn't need orders. He knew exactly what would happen next. 5 minutes, maybe less. Those men would be overrun, captured, or killed. He looked at his remaining rockets. Not enough, not even close. He made a decision instantly. He turned south, pushed the throttle forward. The Grasshopper surged ahead at full speed, 90 miles per hour. Back toward the airstrip, he needed more rockets, and he was coming back to landing was off too fast, too hard. The Grasshopper bounced twice before slamming onto the dirt strip and skidding to a stop. Before the aircraft even fully settled, Morrison was already running toward him with a crew. "How many?" Morrison shouted. 2 confirmed. Carpenter yelled back, maybe 3, no time, reload now. The ground crew moved instantly. They had practiced 6 men, 6 rockets. Each bazooka had to be reloaded manually. 1 man held the launcher steady. Another inserted the rocket carefully from the rear. Connections checked, wires secured, moved to next. Carpenter didn't shut down the engine, didn't climb out, didn't relax. He just sat there, hands gripping the controls, watching the clock in his head. Every second mattered. Those men out there were still trapped. 1 minute, 90 seconds. Morrison gave a thumbs up. Loaded. Carpenter released the brakes. The Grasshopper surged forward again. Moments later, he was airborne again. 12 minutes after his first attack, Carpenter was back over Arracourt, but the battlefield had changed. The disabled Panther still smoked where it had stopped, but the others had They formed a defensive line around the trapped American vehicles. Infantry had dismounted. They were advancing across a wheat field, closing in. Carpenter came in from the east. The sun was behind him, blinding, perfect. The Germans didn't see him at first. 600 feet, he dove again, this time faster, more aggressive. He flipped 2 switches almost simultaneously. 2 rockets launched in quick succession. The first missed, slamming into the ground between vehicles, but the second hit direct impact on a half-track. The explosion tore it apart instantly. Flames erupted outward, burning fuel spread across the field. German infantry scattered in chaos, and that was enough. The American crews saw their engines roared. Trucks moved. They broke cover and ran. Carpenter made another pass. 2 rockets left 2 chances. He lined up a Panther, fired. The rocket struck near the turret ring. The tank jerked violently. The turret stopped moving, jammed. The gun was useless now. Final rocket. He targeted another armored vehicle, fired it. Disabled. Carpenter pulled up, climbed to 1,500 feet, and circled. Below him, the battlefield shifted. The German advance slowed, then stopped, then began to fall back. The Panthers turned, retreating. The American support crews were gone. Safe. Carpenter exhaled slowly. His hands trembled uncontrollably, but he was still flying, and for the first time he hadn't just watched, he had changed the outcome. When Major Charles Carpenter shut down the engine after his second sortie, the sudden silence felt unnatural. For the last hour, his world had been filled with the roar of the engine, the crack of machine guns, and the violent shock of rockets leaving his wings. Now there was nothing but the faint sound of wind moving across the open airstrip. He didn't move. His hands were still gripping the controls, and they were shaking uncontrollably. Not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming surge of adrenaline that had not yet left his body. He stared straight ahead, replaying everything in his mind: the dive, the gunfire, the explosion, the moment the Panther stopped moving. For months he had watched battles unfold from above. He had tracked enemy positions, called in artillery, and listened to men die over the radio. Today was the first time he had changed the outcome himself. Morrison approached the aircraft slowly, studying both the plane and the man inside it. The fabric on the wing was torn in several places. One of the struts had fresh scratches from shrapnel. The instrument panel had a hole where a bullet had punched through. The Grasshopper looked like it had no right to still be flying. Morrison asked. Carpenter nodded once, still staring for it. Reloaded, he said quietly. That was enough. Within seconds, the ground crew moved into action. They worked faster this time, more confidently. What had been an experiment only hours earlier was now something very real. Each bazooka tube was opened, inspected, and reloaded with fresh rockets. Wires were checked carefully, connections tightened. No one spoke much. They all understood what was happening. Carpenter remained in the cockpit, engine idling, eyes distant. He wasn't resting, he was thinking. The image of the trapped American support crew stayed in his mind. He knew how close they had come to being wiped out. He also knew that the Germans would not make the same mistake twice. By early afternoon, he was airborne again. This time he flew lower than before. The Grasshopper skimmed just above the ground, its shadow racing across fields and broken terrain. Flying high had been safe once, but not anymore. Now it made him visible, now it made him a target. He kept the aircraft low, using the terrain for cover, rising only when necessary. Near Nancy, he spotted movement on a narrow dirt road cutting through a wooded area. A column of German trucks moved steadily along it, spaced just enough to avoid collision, but close enough to suggest urgency. Fuel barrels were visible in the back of several vehicles. Others carried crates of ammunition. It was exactly the kind of target he had learned to recognize instantly. He circled once, gaining a small amount of altitude, just enough to line up and approach. Then he dove. The first truck never saw it coming. Carpenter flipped the switch and the rocket launched cleanly. It struck the front of the vehicle, detonating with a sharp explosion that sent flames erupting outward. The truck came to an immediate stop, blocking the road. The convoy behind it reacted too slowly. A second rocket followed almost immediately, hitting another vehicle further back. The explosion trapped the rest of the convoy between burning wreckage. Drivers panicked. Some tried to reverse. Others abandoned their vehicles and ran for cover. Carpenter made another pass. Machine gun fire began to rise toward him now, but it was scattered and uncoordinated. The Germans had not yet adapted to this kind of attack. He fired again. Another truck exploded, followed by another. Within moments, the entire road had become a corridor of fire. Flames spread rapidly as fuel ignited. Ammunition began detonating inside the vehicles, sending secondary explosions rippling through the convoy. Carpenter pulled up, climbing away from the destruction. He didn't need to stay and observe. He knew what he had done. That supply column would not reach its destination. When he returned to the airstrip, he found more people waiting than before. Word had spread quickly. Pilots who had never seen combat like this stood watching. Ground crews paused in their work. Even officers had come to see the aircraft. Carpenter climbed out of the cockpit without ceremony. He looked tired but focused. A correspondent stepped forward and asked him if the stories were true, if he had really attacked tanks with a Grasshopper. Carpenter gave a simple answer: if they're targets, I hit them. By evening, Major General John Wood arrived. He walked around the aircraft slowly, examining the bazookas mounted beneath the wings, the patched fabric, the signs of damage. Then he looked at Carpenter.
You think this can be done again, Wood asked?
Carpenter answered without hesitation. Yes. Wood studied him for a moment, then nodded. That was all he needed to hear. Within days, other pilots began volunteering. Some were curious, others were skeptical. A few understood immediately what this meant. 3 pilots were selected first, and their aircraft were modified in the same way. Each of them understood the risk. The Grasshopper was not built for combat. It had no armor, no protection. Attacking ground targets meant flying directly into enemy fire. But it also meant something else. It meant they didn't have to just watch anymore. German units, however, were already beginning to notice a pattern. Reports came in from multiple positions: small American aircraft attacking from low altitude, rockets striking supply vehicles, tanks being damaged from above. At first, the reports seemed exaggerated, then they became too consistent to ignore. Orders were issued quickly. All American liaison aircraft were now to be treated as hostile. Any sighting was to be engaged immediately. The change was immediate. Where once Grasshoppers had flown almost unnoticed, they were now hunted. Machine guns opened fire the moment one appeared. Anti-aircraft weapons tracked them aggressively. Even tank crews began aiming upward. Carpenter noticed it on his next mission. He approached at a moderate altitude, expecting the usual lack of response. Instead, fire erupted from the ground almost instantly. Tracers filled the air around him. He dropped low immediately, diving toward cover. The Grasshopper shaking as bullets tore through the air nearby. He escaped, but barely. That was the moment he understood completely. The sky had changed. From that point on, he adapted his tactics. He flew low, dangerously low, sometimes no more than 50 feet above the ground. He used terrain constantly, hiding behind hills, following tree lines, even flying along riverbeds to stay out of sight. He stopped attacking from predictable angles. Instead of diving from above, he approached from the side, from behind, from directions the enemy didn't expect. He appeared suddenly, fired, and disappeared just as quickly. The Germans struggled to adjust. Their weapons were designed to engage fast-moving aircraft at high altitude. The Grasshopper was slow, small, and unpredictable. By the time they tracked it, it was already gone. Still, the danger increased with every mission. On one flight near Metz, a flak gunner spotted him early. There was no hesitation this time. The gun opened fire immediately, sending shells exploding around him. Fragments tore through the fabric of the wings. One piece struck the tail section. The aircraft shuddered violently. Carpenter dropped altitude, pushing the aircraft to its limits as he escaped. For a moment, it seemed like the Grasshopper might not hold together, but it did barely. When he landed, the damage was obvious. The aircraft was patched again, repaired just enough to fly, and then he went back up, because now there was no going back to being just an observer. By October 18, 1944, the situation around Arracourt had shifted again. Reports coming into the 4th Armored Division spoke of something larger forming beyond the front lines. Reconnaissance suggested a major German buildup of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, all concentrating for a counterattack that could break the American advance entirely. This wasn't a scattered force, this was deliberate, dangerous. Major Charles Carpenter heard the reports like everyone else, but unlike most, he understood what they meant from the air. He had seen how quickly German armor could overwhelm positions when given the chance. He had watched entire units disappear under coordinated attack. On the morning of October 19th, before sunrise had fully broken across the fields, Carpenter was called to a forward command post. The air inside was tense. Maps were spread across tables marked with grease pencil lines and shifting front positions. Major General John Wood stood near the center, speaking with officers in low, controlled tones. When Carpenter entered, Wood turned toward him immediately. "I need eyes out there," Wood said. "Everything you can see. Tank positions, movement, defensive lines." He paused for a moment, then added quietly, "And if you see targets, you know what to do." Carpenter nodded once. There was no need for further explanation. This mission was not just observation anymore. At first light, Carpenter's Grasshopper lifted off the strip, followed by two more aircraft flying loose formation at a distance. The sky was clear, the ground below still damp with early morning dew. Visibility was good too. That meant the Germans could see him just as easily as he could see them. He flew low at first, using the terrain to mask his approach. The land rolled gently in that region, with ridges, scattered trees, and narrow valleys cutting through farmland. Every feature became part of his path, something to hide behind or move along. As he moved east, the signs became obvious: tracks in the ground for Chevy, multiple vehicles. Then he saw German armor, dozens of tanks positioned along a ridgeline, hull down behind the crest. Only their turrets were visible, carefully placed to cover the approaches from the west. It was a defensive position designed to stop a frontal assault cold. Any American force advancing directly into that line would be exposed long before they could return effective fire. Carpenter circled at a distance, studying the formation. There were more than expected, not just Panthers. He counted heavier shapes, 2 Tiger tanks, larger and more heavily armored. The Germans had prepared this position carefully, but they had made one assumption: they were looking west. Carpenter turned north, widening his arc. He stayed low, moving out of sight behind the ridgeline, then curved back around, approaching from the opposite direction, from the east, with the rising sun behind him. The light worked in his favor, washing out his silhouette and making it harder to detect him against the sky. He climbed slightly, just enough to clear the ridge. Then he was above them. For a brief moment, the entire formation lay exposed beneath him. Rows of tanks, engines idling, crews focused forward, none of them looking up. Carpenter didn't hesitate. He pushed the nose down and began his dive. The first rocket left the wing cleanly, then another, 6 in rapid succession, each one trailing smoke as it dropped toward the targets below. The first struck a Panther near the rear of the formation. The explosion hit the engine deck, sending flames bursting upward. The second rocket hit closer to the center line, damaging another tank, forcing it to halt. The third struck near a heavier tank, possibly a Tiger, impacting along the upper structure. The explosion didn't destroy it outright, but it disabled movement below. Chaos erupted. Crew scrambled. Turrets began rotating in all directions. Machine guns opened fire wildly into the air. Carpenter pulled up sharply, climbing away as tracers reached for him. Behind him, the other 2 aircraft followed. They dove in staggered passes, firing their own rockets into the formation. More explosions, more smoke, more confusion. Within seconds, the carefully arranged German defensive line began to break apart. Tanks shifted positions, some pulling back, others turning to face threats they couldn't clearly see. The advantage of preparation was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Carpenter climbed to a safer altitude and circled briefly. He counted at least several vehicles damaged or disabled. More importantly, the formation itself had been disrupted. That was enough. He turned back toward the airstrip. The landing was quick, controlled, efficient. Refueling and rearming began immediately. There was no ceremony, no pause. The scale of what was unfolding meant time mattered more than anything else. Within minutes, Carpenter was airborne again. The second sortie took him further south, where intelligence suggested supply lines were feeding the armored units he had just attacked. He didn't have to search long. A long column of trucks moved along a narrow road, tightly packed, carrying fuel and ammunition. Carpenter approached low, using a tree line for cover. At the last moment, he climbed just enough to line up his shot. The first rocket struck near the middle of the column. The explosion ignited fuel instantly. Fire spread rapidly from one vehicle to the next. The second rocket hit closer to the front, sealing the road. The convoy had nowhere to go. Within minutes, the entire column was engulfed. Explosions rippled down the line as ammunition ignited. Thick black smoke rose high into the sky. A supply line that had taken days to assemble was gone in minutes. Carpenter pulled away again. He didn't need confirmation. The damage was obvious. The third sortie came before midday. By now, German forces were fully alert. Anti-aircraft fire increased. Machine guns fired more accurately. Carpenter adjusted again, flying even lower, using every feature of the terrain to remain hidden until the last possible moment. Near a wooded area, he spotted movement. Self-propelled artillery positioned behind partial cover, firing toward American lines. They hadn't moved yet, still focused on their targets. Carpenter approached from the side, rising just enough to clear the trees. He fired. One rocket struck the first vehicle. The explosion tore through the gun mount. The second rocket hit another, disabling it instantly. The remaining units scattered, abandoning their positions. The artillery threat was reduced. By mid-afternoon, Carpenter had flown multiple sorties, each one different, each one dangerous, each one pushing both pilot and aircraft beyond what they had been designed to endure. And yet the results were undeniable. German movement slowed, attacks disrupted, supply lines destroyed, positions weakened before American ground forces even arrived. When U.S. units finally advanced toward the contested areas, they encountered resistance but not the overwhelming force that had been expected. The defensive line had already been shaken, the attack had already been weakened, not by bombers, not by heavy artillery, but by small aircraft flying low, striking fast, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. When Carpenter finally returned that evening, the airstrip felt different again. There was less curiosity, now more understanding. What had started as an experiment was no longer uncertain. It had become part of the fun. Carpenter shut down the engine and sat quietly for a moment before climbing out. His uniform was stained with sweat and dust. His face showed exhaustion, but there was something else there now, clarity. He had found a way to fight back, and in doing so, he had changed something larger than a single battle. He had shown that even the smallest, weakest-looking aircraft could become a weapon if used differently. Around him, mechanics moved in to check the aircraft again, inspecting damage, preparing for whatever came next, because the war wasn't over, not even close, and tomorrow he would fly again. By the end of October 1944, what Major Charles Carpenter had started as a desperate improvisation was no longer an isolated act. It had become a pattern. Reports from across the front began to mention the same thing. Small American liaison aircraft attacking from low altitude, striking tanks, destroying supply columns, disrupting movements in ways no one had expected from such fragile machines. At first, higher command treated the idea cautiously. There were no manuals for it, no official doctrine, no training programs. Technically, what Carpenter had done wasn't even authorized when it began, but war had a way of rewriting rules quickly, and results were impossible to ignore. Across the 4th Armored Division, and soon beyond it, more L-4 Grasshoppers were being modified. Bazookas mounted under wings, wiring systems improvised. Pilots briefed not just to observe, but to strike when opportunity presented itself. Not every pilot embraced it. Some saw it for what it was, a dangerous gamble in an aircraft never meant for combat. Flying low over enemy armor, within range of machine guns and flak, without armor or protection, required a kind of mindset not everyone had. But enough volunteered, enough read. And slowly the idea spread. What had begun with one aircraft and one pilot became dozens. Not enough to replace fighter bombers, not enough to dominate the battlefield, but enough to matter. They became something new, a constant threat, unpredictable, hard to track, harder to stop. German forces adapted as best they could. Extra machine guns were mounted on tanks. Crews were trained to watch the sky as much as the ground. Flak positions were adjusted to cover likely approach paths. Orders were repeated again and again, engage any small aircraft immediately. But the problem remained. The Grasshopper was too slow, too small, too unexpected. It didn't behave like other aircraft. It didn't follow predictable patterns. It appeared suddenly, fired, and disappeared behind terrain before a proper response could be organized. By the time gunners adjusted their aim, it was already gone. Carpenter continued flying through all of it, mission after mission, day after day. Each flight carried the same risks. Each attack required the same precision. He never had the luxury of distance. Every target meant getting close, too close. He destroyed trucks, armored cars, artillery positions. Always the tanks. They were still the most dangerous threat. The battlefield. Still the reason he had started all of this. Official records credited him with 6 destroyed German tanks, 2 Tigers, 4 Panthers. Unofficially, many believed the number was higher. Some said 8, others said more than a dozen. But counting was never exact. From the air, in the chaos of battle, it was hard to confirm what had been destroyed and what had only been damaged. Carpenter didn't argue the numbers. He didn't try to increase them, because for him, the count wasn't the point. The point was what those destroyed tanks didn't do. They didn't fire on American crews. They didn't advance into defensive lines. They didn't kill the men he had once listened to over the radio. That was enough. By November, what he had proven in the field was recognized formally. Technical bulletins began circulating, instructions on how to mount bazookas on L-4 aircraft, guidelines for attack angles, recommendations for low-altitude approaches. What had started as improvisation became procedure. Other units began adopting it, not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to leave a mark. Carpenter had helped create a new way of fighting, one that didn't rely on heavy armor or fast aircraft, but on adaptability, timing, and the willingness to take risks others avoided. He never called it innovation. He never described it as strategy. To him, it had been simple. There was a problem. Men were dying. He found a way to do something about it. As winter approached, the war in Europe entered a new phase. Weather worsened, operations slowed, conditions became harsher. But Carpenter kept flying. The missions didn't stop, and neither did the danger. By early 1945, his body began to change. At first, it was subtle fatigue that didn't go away, longer recovery after flights. Moments of weakness he couldn't explain, he ignored it. Like many soldiers he pushed through, there was always another mission, another target, another reason to keep going, but the symptoms grew worse. Night sweats, weight loss, exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to fix. Eventually, the flight surgeon noticed, ordered him to report for evaluation. Carpenter resisted at first, then complied. The diagnosis came weeks later: Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the lymphatic system. At the time, treatment options were limited, outcomes uncertain. Doctors gave him an estimate: 2 years, maybe less. The war he had survived from the sky had not taken him. Something else would. In 1946, Carpenter was honorably discharged. The Army promoted him to lieutenant colonel. He received his medals, recognition for his actions, acknowledgement of what he had done. Then he went home, back to Illinois, back to the life he had left behind. He walked into a school building not long after Urbana High School, the same place where he had once taught history. The principal looked at him with disbelief. "You're supposed to be dying," he said. Carpenter answered simply, "Then I'd rather spend the time teaching," and he did. For years, he returned to the classroom, taught American history, explained wars, battles, decisions that shaped the world, but rarely spoke of his own. Students noticed the medal, the silver star on display. They asked questions. He changed the subject, talked about something else another time, because in his mind, others deserved the attention more. The men in the tanks, the infantry on the ground, the ones who didn't come back. He never saw himself as exceptional, only as someone who had done what needed to be done. Time passed. Years turned into decades. The war faded into history. But for those who had flown with him, who had seen what he did, the memory remained. When Carpenter died on March 22, 1966, he was not alone. Dozens of former Army aviators attended his funeral. Men who had flown Grasshoppers, men who had mounted bazookas under their wings, men who had taken the same risks. Every one of them understood what he had started, what he had proven. That even in a war dominated by machines and firepower, one person's decision could still change the way battles were fought. His aircraft did not return home with him. After the war, it remained in Europe, painted, used for civilian flying, its history forgotten. For years, it passed quietly from one owner to another. No one knew what it had been, what it had done. Then, decades later, researchers began tracing records, serial numbers, maintenance logs, fragments of history that still existed in archive. Eventually, they found it, the same aircraft, the same frame, the same machine that had once carried 6 bazookas into battle. Restoration took time. Layers of paint were removed, old damage was uncovered, bullet holes patched with fabric, marks left by war, the mounting points where weapons had once been attached. Every detail told a story. When it was complete, the aircraft was displayed again, not as a weapon, but as a memory, a reminder. People could stand beneath it, look up at its thin wings, its simple structure, and try to imagine flying it into combat. Try to understand what it meant to take something so fragile and turn it into something capable of fighting back. Numbers can tell part of the story. 6 tanks destroyed, dozens of vehicles, multiple missions shot down, but numbers never capture the full reality. What Carpenter did was not just about destruction, it was about refusal to accept that his role was only to watch. Refusal to accept that nothing could be done. He saw a gap, a weakness, and instead of waiting for someone else to solve it, he acted. That decision changed more than a single battle. It influenced how small aircraft could be used, how low-altitude attacks could disrupt stronger forces, how adaptability could overcome limitations. Long after the war, those ideas would evolve, refined, expanded, developed into new forms of aerial warfare, attack helicopters, close support aircraft, all carrying the same basic principle: get close, strike precisely, disappear before the enemy can respond. The roots of that thinking traced back to moments like those over Arracourt, to a history teacher who refused to stay an observer. And in the end, that is what remained, not just the aircraft, not just the missions, but the choice to act when others could not, to change something even when the odds said it couldn't be done. And because of that, men who might have died that day went home and